Breaking news, you're looking at video of one of the last times Oscar winner Gene Hackman, a known recluse in recent years.
Now with new details on the investigation into the death of actor Gene Hackman, including newly released video.
As for the inside footage, Hackman's estate wants to block that release, citing privacy.
On the afternoon of February 26, 2025, a maintenance worker walked up to a gated property on Old Sunset Trail, just outside Santa Fe, New Mexico. He was there to do routine work. He left having made a discovery that would dominate national headlines for weeks. Inside that house, one of the most decorated actors in American film history, Gene Hackman, and his wife, the classical pianist Betsy Arakawa, were dead. So was one of their 3 dogs. What followed was not a scandal, not a conspiracy, and not the kind of mystery that tabloids love to manufacture. It was something quieter and, in its own way, far sadder. The story of an isolated elderly couple, a rare and little-known virus, a devoted husband whose mind had already begun slipping away from him, and the weeks it took investigators to piece together exactly what happened behind those gates. This is the real story, built from the official findings of the New Mexico Office of the Medical Investigator, the Santa Fe County Sheriff's Office, and the reporting that followed their news conferences. No hidden tunnels. No secret chambers. Just the facts, and what they tell us about how 2 private people spent their final days. To understand why this story became so consuming, it helps to remember who these 2 people actually were. Gene Hackman was, by any measure, one of the defining American actors of the 20th century. Born in California in 1930 and raised largely in Illinois, he spent years scraping by in small roles before breaking through in Bonnie and Clyde in 1967. 4 years later, his performance as the relentless, morally compromised detective Popeye Doyle in The French Connection won him his first Academy Award. He would go on to build a career defined by range rather than typecasting, the paranoid surveillance expert in The Conversation, the villainous Lex Luthor in the Superman films, the ruthless sheriff in Unforgiven, which brought him a second Oscar, and the beloved basketball coach in Hoosiers. By the time he retired from acting in the early 2000s, he had appeared in more than 80 films and was widely regarded as one of the finest actors of his generation. After retirement, Hackman largely disappeared from public life. He settled into his home in Santa Fe, took up painting and writing novels, and by most accounts lived a quiet, private existence with Arakawa, whom he had married in 1991. Arakawa herself was an accomplished classical pianist, a University of Southern California graduate who had met Hackman while working at a California gym in the mid-1980s. Those who knew the couple described them as intensely private but devoted to one another. Arakawa reportedly managed much of Hackman's day-to-day life in his later years, from scheduling his golf outings to handling calls with old friends. It's worth pausing on that detail, because it becomes important later. As Hackman aged and his health declined, Arakawa was, by the account of people close to the couple, effectively his primary caretaker. There was no live-in nurse, no daily caregiver rotation, no household staff checking in each morning. It was largely just the 2 of them, and their dogs, behind a gate in the New Mexico hills. When deputies arrived at the property on February 26, at around 1:45 in the afternoon, they found a scene that was immediately unsettling, though not for the reasons that spread online in the days that followed. Hackman's body was found in what investigators believe was a mudroom or entryway, dressed in sweatpants, a long-sleeve shirt, and slippers, with a cane and a pair of sunglasses nearby. It appeared, according to the search warrant, that he had fallen suddenly. Arakawa's body was found in a bathroom near the front door. Both bodies showed signs of decomposition consistent with having been there for some time, bloating, and in the case of Arakawa's hands and feet, partial mummification. Near Arakawa, inside a closed kennel in a bathroom closet, deputies also found the body of Zina, the couple's 12-year-old Australian Kelpie mix. The couple's 2 other dogs, a pair of German shepherds named Bear and Nikita, were found alive, wandering the property. Both the front and back doors of the house had been left ajar, apparently allowing them to move freely in and out. There was no forced entry. No broken windows, no signs of a struggle, no blood, no evidence of trauma on either body. Investigators did note early on that natural gas service to the home showed several minor code issues, what the gas company called red tags, but both a carbon monoxide leak and carbon monoxide poisoning were ruled out fairly quickly. Both Hackman and Arakawa later tested negative for carbon monoxide in their systems. Even so, because 2 people and a pet had died under circumstances that weren't immediately explainable, and because of the state the bodies were found in, the Santa Fe County Sheriff's Office labeled the deaths suspicious. a standard, procedural classification used any time a death investigation requires a full scene examination, not an indication that foul play was suspected. That distinction got lost almost immediately in the public conversation. No signs of foul play and suspicious appeared in the same statements, and to a public unfamiliar with how medical investigators use that language, it looked contradictory. It wasn't. It reflected a department being careful, treating an unexplained double death exactly the way protocol requires, while being honest that nothing pointed toward violence. For the first several days after the discovery, the biggest question wasn't how Hackman and Arakawa died, it was when, and in what order. Investigators went to work reconstructing their final movements using every tool available: surveillance footage from the gated community, cell phone records, a monthly planner recovered from the home, pharmacy and medical records, and, critically, data recorded by Hackman's pacemaker. The picture that emerged was specific and, frankly, heartbreaking. Surveillance footage showed Arakawa running errands and using her key fob to re-enter the gated community on February 11th. That was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. Records showed she had picked up Zina from a Santa Fe veterinary hospital on February 9th, following a major surgical procedure, which explained why the dog had been confined to a crate in the first place. Staff had instructed her to keep Zina restricted to limit the dog's movement while it recovered. Investigators also found that in the days before her presumed death, Arakawa had been making internet searches and phone inquiries about flu-like symptoms and breathing techniques, behavior consistent with someone who was starting to feel seriously unwell and trying to understand what was happening to her, likely without yet knowing how serious it was. After February 11th, her emails went unopened. Her phone went quiet. Hackman's pacemaker told the rest of the story. Investigators determined that the device recorded its last cardiac event on February 17th, suggesting Hackman likely died around February 18th, roughly a week after his wife. That gap is the single most important fact in this entire case, and it's also the most difficult one to sit with. For approximately a week, a 95-year-old man in advanced physical decline was alone in that house with his wife's body. The full picture didn't become public until March 7th, when New Mexico's chief medical investigator, Dr. Heather Jarrell, held a news conference alongside Santa Fe County Sheriff Adon Mendoza to release the official findings. Arakawa's cause of death was hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, a rare, severe respiratory illness caused by a virus carried primarily by deer mice, transmitted to humans through contact with rodent droppings, urine, or saliva, most often when contaminated dust is disturbed and inhaled. It is not contagious between people. In New Mexico, where the virus is more prevalent than in most of the country because of the deer mouse population, there have been roughly 136 confirmed human cases over the past 50 years, and historically about 42% of those cases have been fatal. Investigators later confirmed that inspectors had found evidence of rodent entry points in some structures on the property, though the state veterinarian noted the overall risk at the home had been comparable to that of any well-maintained New Mexico residence. This wasn't a property overrun with pests, just an unlucky and largely unavoidable exposure. Arakawa's autopsy showed heavy, congested lungs and fluid buildup in her chest, consistent with the syndrome. She tested negative for COVID-19 and the flu, and toxicology showed nothing unusual beyond a normal amount of caffeine in her system. Hackman's cause of death was different, and in its own way, just as unforgiving. He died of hypertensive and atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, severe, long-standing heart disease, the kind that had already required multiple surgical interventions over his lifetime and had left evidence of prior heart attacks. His kidneys showed damage consistent with years of chronic high blood pressure. And critically, an examination of his brain confirmed advanced Alzheimer's disease, along with blood vessel changes in the brain also tied to his chronic hypertension. Dr. Jarrell noted that Alzheimer's was listed as a significant contributing factor in his death. He tested negative for hantavirus. He had no food in his stomach when he died, though he did not appear to be dehydrated, suggesting he had continued drinking water in his final days even as his eating had stopped. It was Dr. Jarrell who spoke the sentence that, more than any other piece of evidence in this case, explains what actually happened in that house. Given the advanced state of Hackman's Alzheimer's disease, she said, it was quite possible that he was never aware his wife had died. Read that again because it reframes everything. This wasn't a man who spent a week in psychological anguish, refusing to call for help while his wife's body lay elsewhere in the house. The far more likely, and far sadder, explanation is that a man in the late stages of a devastating cognitive disease simply did not register what had happened. His wife, who by all accounts had quietly become his primary caregiver and the person managing nearly every practical aspect of his life, was suddenly gone, and there may have been no one left who fully understood that fact, including, tragically, Hackman himself. The fate of Zinna, the couple's oldest dog, was the last piece of the investigation to be resolved, and it took weeks longer than the human autopsies because it required a separate necropsy through the state's Department of Agriculture Veterinary Lab. When that report came back, it found no evidence of infectious disease, trauma, or poisoning. Zinna's stomach contained almost nothing, just small amounts of hair and bile. Despite significant post-mortem decomposition and partial mummification that could have masked some findings, the conclusion investigators reached was that the dog most likely died of dehydration and starvation after being left in her crate, unable to free herself once there was no longer anyone in the house able to care for her. It's a detail that's easy to skip past in a story full of bigger, more famous names, but it may be the most quietly devastating part of the entire timeline. Zinna wasn't roaming free like Bear and Nikita, the couple's 2 German shepherds, who were found alive on the property, able to move in and out through doors left ajar and presumably to find food and water on their own. Zinna was confined, recovering from surgery, entirely dependent on human care, and the one person who had been reliably providing that care, according to the veterinary hospital's own staff, was Arakawa. Once she was gone, and once Hackman was no longer capable of stepping in, there was no one left to open that crate. One of the questions that dominated early coverage of this case was a simple one. How does a world-famous actor and his wife go missing for what turned out to be roughly 2 weeks without anyone noticing? The answer says less about anything sinister and more about how deliberately private the couple's life had become in their later years. By multiple accounts, Hackman and Arakawa lived quietly and kept a small circle. There was no live-in household staff checking in daily. Friends who spoke to reporters afterward, including a longtime acquaintance who told the New York Times he had known Hackman for 2 decades, said it was almost always Arakawa he communicated with by phone. She functioned as the point of contact for the couple's social and logistical life. When she stopped answering, calls likely just went unanswered, the way they might for any elderly couple who preferred to keep to themselves and whose friends assumed they simply wanted space. The sheriff himself, at one of the news conferences, made a point of saying that anyone who knew the couple understood they were very private individuals and a very private family. It wasn't a household built around secrecy in some dramatic sense. It was simply a household built around solitude, at a stage of life when that solitude had quietly become dangerous. There were no surveillance cameras inside the home, sheriff's investigators noted, a detail that undercuts any notion of some elaborate, high-tech compound. It was, by the descriptions that emerged, a large but fairly ordinary private residence, home to 2 aging people who valued their privacy and had, over the decades, built a life that made it easy for the outside world to go a long time without checking in. By mid-March, the Santa Fe County Sheriff's Office had what it needed: full autopsy and toxicology results for both Hackman and Arakawa, a necropsy on Zinna, cell phone data, pharmacy records, surveillance footage, and interviews with staff and associates. Every strand of evidence pointed in the same direction. Arakawa died first, on or around February 11th, from a hantavirus infection she had almost certainly contracted through ordinary exposure on the property, an illness so rare that fewer than a couple of dozen New Mexicans are diagnosed with it in a typical year, and one that can move from flu-like symptoms to respiratory failure with frightening speed. Hackman, already in an advanced stage of Alzheimer's disease and suffering from severe underlying heart disease, died roughly a week later, on or around February 18th, likely without ever comprehending that his wife had passed. Both deaths were formally ruled natural. No trauma. No poisoning. No third party involved. The case, once officially the subject of intense speculation about foul play, closed the way the earliest and least dramatic evidence had actually pointed from day one. The sheriff's spokesperson noted at the time that the case would remain technically active only until the final pieces of the phone record timeline were confirmed, a bureaucratic formality, not a sign that investigators doubted their own conclusions. It's worth being honest about the limits of the public record here, because that honesty is part of what got lost in so much of the coverage that followed. We don't know the exact hour either Hackman or Arakawa died, only estimated dates, drawn from surveillance footage, digital activity, and pacemaker data. We don't know precisely what Hackman experienced or understood during that final week, only that his advanced Alzheimer's makes it plausible he was unaware of his wife's death. We don't know exactly how or when Arakawa was exposed to the hantavirus, only that investigators found evidence of rodent activity on the property consistent with the kind of exposure that causes the illness. Investigators were careful, in their public statements, to frame their conclusions in the language of probability, reasonable to conclude, quite possible, most likely, rather than absolute certainty, because that is what the physical evidence actually supported. That kind of careful, hedged language is normal in any death investigation. It is also, unfortunately, exactly the kind of language that gets stripped of its nuance once a story starts circulating widely online. A medical examiner saying, "It's reasonable to conclude," becomes, a few retellings later, an unqualified fact, and the empty space where real uncertainty exists gets filled in by speculation, and eventually by outright invention. Strip away the noise, and what's left is not a mystery. It's a case study in something quietly common and rarely discussed: the vulnerability of elderly couples who care for each other in isolation, without a broader support system to catch them when something goes wrong. Betsy Arakawa was, by every account, a capable, devoted partner who had taken on the demanding, largely invisible work of managing her husband's care as his health and cognition declined. When she became critically ill herself, through nothing more sinister than an unlucky exposure to a virus most people have never heard of, there was no backup plan, no second-person position to notice something was wrong. Gene Hackman, a man once celebrated for playing some of the most memorable characters in American film, spent his final days in a version of the same fog that had already been closing in on him for months or years, unaware, if the medical evidence is right, that the person who had been managing his world was gone. There is no tunnel beneath that house. There is no hidden chamber, no welded door, no forensic team working in secret to contain some classified discovery. What there is, instead, is a documented, publicly released, medically explained account of how two elderly people who loved each other and who had built their final years around privacy came to die within days of each other, one from a virus, one from disease and a mind that had already begun to let go of the world around it. Gene Hackman built a career on characters who carried enormous, hidden weight: Popeye Doyle's obsession, Harry Call's paranoia in The Conversation, the fear and violence underneath William Money's stillness in Unforgiven. It would be tempting, and it clearly has been tempting for a lot of people online, to read some kind of real-life echo into his final days. But the truth doesn't need that embellishment. The real story: a devoted wife quietly holding a household together, a husband slipping into a disease that eventually took even the awareness of his greatest loss, and the quiet, unremarkable tragedy of how long it can take the world to notice when two private people go silent, is sad enough and true enough on its own.